1958. Tokyo. On the 12th floor of a brand new glass and concrete office building overlooking the Yamanote line, Sato Hiroshi straightened the knot of his tie, opened a cheap stationery notebook, and wrote a sentence that would have earned him a beating from his company section chief if anyone else saw it. "We once worshipped steel in the shape of guns. Now it is the skeleton of office towers." He paused, listening to the sound outside his window, not the drone of B-29s, not the scream of sirens, not the roar of firestorms devouring wooden neighborhoods, cranes, pile drivers, train brakes. The continuous hum of a city rebuilding itself so fast that even men who had seen cities burn could not fully comprehend it. He had just witnessed something that contradicted every assumption drilled into him in the army. He had spent his youth told that a Japanese man's highest purpose was to die for the emperor with a rifle in his hand. Now his superiors told him that a Japanese man's highest purpose was to live for the company with a fountain pen in his hand. In both cases, the same demand, total commitment. No complaints, no exit. The mathematics of post-war Japan's rebirth were not written in grand strategy documents alone. They were etched into the daily exhaustion of millions of men like Sato, former soldiers who traded uniforms for suits and bayonets for briefcases, who learned to fight a new war measured in overtime hours, productivity charts, and subway crush loads. The collapse that made this rebirth possible had begun long before 1958. March 19, 1945. Tokyo. In one night, American B-29s dropped 1,665 tons of incendiaries on the eastern wards of the city. The old wooden houses and narrow streets turned into a furnace. Sato, then a 19-year-old conscript home on brief leave from a training unit, ran alongside rivers of people who were themselves on fire. He saw entire blocks vanish in a single rolling wall of flame. Approximately 100,000 died in those few hours, more than at Nagasaki, almost as many as Hiroshima. The Imperial slogans continued even as the city melted. Endure the unendurable. Sacrifice for the 100 million. By August, 2 atomic clouds had blossomed over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. On August the 15th, 1945, Sato listened in stunned silence as the Emperor's voice, high and unfamiliar, crackled through a radio loudspeaker. "We have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all generations to come, by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable." For the first time in his life, Sato heard the word defeat wrapped in poetic circumlocutions. The numbers were less poetic. Japan's cities, 40% of built-up areas destroyed. Industrial output, less than half its 1937 level. Merchant fleet sunk. Millions of soldiers and civilians dead, millions more displaced. In 1945, the only obvious future was hunger. 1946, 1948, the ruins. Demobilization turned the once mighty Imperial Japanese army into columns of ragged men shuffling off ships. They returned to cities that no longer existed in recognizable form. Tokyo, Osaka, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe. From the air, they looked like scabbed wounds. From the ground, like landscapes after an earthquake that had also stolen food. Sato came back to Tokyo in late 1946, traveling with other former conscripts in a freight car meant for Kobe. At Ueno Station, the same hall where pre-war students had once boarded trains for vacations, now housed vagrant children. War orphans sleeping under newspapers, forming their own micro-societies of theft and begging. Sato's family house in a downtown ward was gone. An empty lot, some melted tiles, and a twisted metal bathtub remained. His mother had evacuated to relatives in the countryside. His father had died in 1944, not from enemy bullets, but from overwork and malnutrition in a munitions factory. The Empire had not even given him a death notification envelope. He simply stopped coming home one day. Japan's defeat had stripped away not just buildings, but the entire ideological scaffolding of Sato's youth. At 16, he had memorized Imperial rescripts, shouted schoolyard oaths promising that he would offer his body to the state. At 20, he bartered his old bayonet on the black market for 2 kilos of rice. The occupation forces, tall, well-fed Americans in jeeps, arrived like aliens. Their uniforms were clean, their cigarettes endless, their pockets full of chocolate bars. In 1946, CASCAP, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, effectively General MacArthur's government, began issuing decrees that rewrote Japan's political DNA. The military was abolished. The Constitution renounced war forever in Article 9. Zaibatsu conglomerates were ordered to be broken up. Land reform redistributed estates from landlords to tenant farmers. To a man like Sato, most of this was as far removed from daily life as the emperor's voice had been from his barracks radio years earlier. His question was more immediate. How do I eat today? Food shortages were severe. Official rations, when they arrived, were insufficient. Many survived only through black market dealings, petty theft, and parcels from relatives in rural areas. Tokyo's open spaces filled with makeshift shacks built from scrap wood and corrugated metal. Kasutoric housing named after cheap bad liquor. Men who had once saluted generals now sold cigarettes one by one from flattened cardboard boxes. Women traded heirloom kimonos for sacks of beans. Among the ex-SOT soldiers there was another quiet transformation. They had been trained to take orders, to move in formation, to endure, to suppress individuality. In the ruins, those same traits became survival tools. They stood in lines. They obeyed ration office instructions. They endured humiliations without protest. The empire that had demanded their obedience had vanished. A different, invisible machine was beginning to assemble itself. The future corporate state. 1949, 1951. The new army wears suits. By the late 1940s, the worst of the outright hunger began to ease. The American occupation authorities, alarmed at inflation and social unrest, pushed economic stabilization. At the same time, world politics shifted. The Cold War hardened. Mao took China. The Soviet Union tested an atomic bomb. In Washington, policymakers looked at Japan not just as a defeated enemy to be punished, but as a potential bulwark against communism in Asia. The logic was cold and simple. A prosperous Japan is a stable Japan. A stable Japan is a reliable ally. Economic reconstruction moved from rhetoric to reality. Factories once producing shells and aircraft parts were retooled to produce sewing machines, bicycles, and eventually cars and electronics. Companies needed workers, not temporary day laborers, but reliable, disciplined men who would accept low wages in exchange for some promise of security. The same generation that had filled the ranks of the Imperial Army now filled the hiring halls of corporations. Mitsubishi, Toshiba, Hitachi, Sumitomo, countless smaller firms. Sato, with only a middle school education and a thin record as an infantry private, joined a mid-sized trading company in 1949 as a clerk. He was 23. On his first day, the department head, a former Navy paymaster, addressed the new recruits. "From today, you are not individuals. You are members of this company. Our company will protect you. In return, you will give your best for life." It sounded disturbingly familiar. Replace company with emperor. And the sentence could have been spoken in any pre-war barracks. The difference lay in the tools. In the army, discipline was enforced with boots and rifles. In the company, discipline was enforced with lifetime employment, promises, seniority pay scales, bonuses, and the ever-present fear of being labeled disloyal or uncooperative in a society with few safety nets. The so-called Japanese employment system emerged, lifetime employment for a core of male workers. Lifetime employment for a core of male workers, seniority or based wages and promotions, company unions that were rarely truly independent, corporate welfare, housing, healthcare, even recreation. To outside analysts in later decades, this system would be praised as harmonious, efficient, uniquely Japanese. To men like Sato, it sometimes felt like conscription under softer lights. Morning assemblies began the day. Workers lined up, bowed to their superiors, recited company mottos. Some firms even had company songs, sung in unison before shifts. "We are the steel that drives Japan forward," went one lyric at a steel mill. At Sato's firm, the song praised loyal service to clients and nation, tie instead of helmet, time card instead of dog tag. The army had taught him to wake at dawn to bugle calls. The company taught him to catch the 6007 a.m. train, crushed between hundreds of other salarymen in identical dark suits, packed by white odd-gloved station attendants. The battleground had changed from jungle islands to the Yamanote line at rush hour. The casualty was time. 1950 to 1953, war as business. The Korean windfall. In June 1950, war broke out on the Korean peninsula. North Korean forces, backed by the Soviet Union and China, invaded the South. The United States, under the banner of the United Nations, intervened. Japan, officially demilitarized, did not send troops. But it sent something arguably more important: supplies. American forces in Korea needed everything, from bullets and uniforms to vehicles. Japan's factories, dockyards, and workshops became the nearest, most convenient source. These were called special procurements. In corporate ledgers, they were simply lifeblood. Orders flooded in. Plants ran triple shifts. Workshops that had barely scraped by repairing household goods suddenly had contracts to refurbish trucks for the U.S. Army. Economists would later say that the Korean War provided the ignition for Japan's economic engine. Industrial production surged. Unemployment dropped. Wages, though still modest, began to rise. For Sato, the change was concrete. Overtime became constant. Bonuses appeared. Small envelopes handed out twice a year, with solemn speeches about gratitude and effort. His company, flush with procurement contracts, offered subsidized housing in a newly built concrete apartment block. From one tiny room in a burnt-out shack shared with relatives, he moved into a two-room unit with tatami mats, running water, and a kitchen sink. He married a young woman he had met through a relative's introduction. She had survived the firebombing of Osaka. On their wedding day, they posed in front of a cheap studio backdrop, a painted Westerner-style house with a garden. "We thought it was ridiculous," he later wrote. But when we looked again after the photograph was printed, it did not look so ridiculous. It looked like something we might see for real someday. The arithmetic of hope had returned. 1945. Survival odds calculated day by day, calorie by calorie. 1951. Savings accounts, installment plans, whispered talk of buying a refrigerator in a few years. Yet, beneath the upward curves, the fault lines of memory and guilt ran deep, the quiet shame of the defeated generation. Japan's post-war narrative held two seemingly contradictory ideas together. 1. The war had been a tragic mistake led by a militarist clique. 2. The people, including soldiers like Sato, had been victims more than perpetrators. In the 1950s, as economic growth accelerated, there was little appetite for dwelling on responsibility. War crimes trials had punished some top leaders. A few notorious officers went to prison. But millions of ordinary veterans returned to ordinary lives with no official reckoning. For Sato, memories of what his unit had done in China and the Philippines did not vanish just because his country now made sewing machines for American housewives. He remembered villages burned for security reasons. He remembered prisoners interrogated with methods never listed in manuals. He remembered starving Filipino children outside barbed wire, eyes too big for their faces. On paper, his service record listed campaigns and commendations. In his head, the line between a victim and a accomplice is blurred. His new life demanded silence. Colleagues spoke of baseball scores, movie stars, the latest American hits on the radio. When the topic of the war came up, it was as inconvenience. The food was bad. The officers were strict. We were all dragged along. In the evenings, after long days at the office, Sato rode home on overcrowded trains. Around him, younger salarymen laughed about promotions, called themselves the first generation with real opportunities. They had been too young to fight. They were too busy to think about firestorms. At home, Sato's children grew up in a different Japan. They ate rice every day, not millet. They drank milk in school. They learned about the war from sanitized textbooks that emphasized victims. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, more than aggressions. Nanjing, Manila. When his son came home from school one day in 1958 and said, "Teacher says Japan is now a peaceful nation. We must never fight again," Sato felt both relief and a hollow ache. The army had once promised meaning in death. The company promised meaning in work. Neither had an answer for what to do with the past. The miracle, measured in hours. By the mid-1950s, foreign observers began using the phrase Japanese economic miracle. GDP grew at rates that stunned Western economists, 8%, 10%, even 12% a year. New factories sprouted on the outskirts of Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya. Smokestacks became as common as temple pagodas. Household goods that had been luxuries in 1950, radios, washing machines, televisions, became attainable for the expanding middle class. Urban skylines transformed. Shinto shrines and wooden houses now stood in the shadows of concrete department stores and office towers. For Sato, working in a trading company that handled steel imports and machine tool exports, the miracle came in the form of numbers on ledgers and increasingly thick annual reports. Orders to buy German presses. Orders to sell Japanese bearings to Southeast Asia. Profits rising. His salary increased with his seniority, as promised. His company offered H. Bonankai's year-end parties with too much sake, speeches about our glorious results, jokes about how they would crush the competition next year. But the miracle had its own battlefield logic. Hours with the ammunition. Overtime was expected, not requested. In the army, Sato had marched until his feet bled because the operation demanded it. In the office, he typed invoices and checked shipping manifests until midnight because the quarter demanded it. Home became a place to sleep and, occasionally, to be reminded that he had a family. His wife joked bitterly once, "In the war, the army took you. Now the company does. At least this time, you come back alive." He did not tell her about colleagues in other firms who had collapsed at their desks from strokes in their 40s. The term "Holoshi, death from overwork" had not yet entered the dictionary, but the phenomenon already existed. The corporate system leveraged the same cultural traits the military had once used: gamane, endurance of hardship without complaint; gajirish, obligation toward group and superiors; shajidan, ishikish, group consciousness over individual desire. In 1944, these words were used to justify holding a hill against advancing Americans. In 1958, they were used to justify staying another 3 hours at the office to finish a client proposal. The enemy had changed from foreign armies to foreign competitors. Steel, from battleships to bridges. When Sato looked out his office window in 1958 and wrote about worshipping steel in new forms, he was not being poetic for its own sake. He had watched the transformation literally. Before and during the war, steel meant weapons, battleships like the Yamato, tanks, artillery, aircraft. Japan starved its civilians to feed those furnaces. Children collected scrap metal from shrines and schoolyards. Housewives donated pots and pans for the war effort. In the 1950s, steel mills roared again, but their products went not into artillery barrels, but into bridges connecting islands and riverbanks, highways slicing through old neighborhoods, factory frames and office tower skeletons, ship hulls carrying cars and radios to the world. The Nippon Steel Corporation, created from merged and reorganized pre-war entities, became a symbol of this shift. New blast furnaces in Kimitsu and other locations dwarfed anything pre-war engineers had built. Each ton of steel now represented not shells but cars, refrigerators, rails. Engineers and policymakers spoke excitedly about heavy and chemical industrialization. In government offices, MITI, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, functioned as a kind of general staff for the economic war. They selected industries to promote, provided cheap credit, protected infant sectors, and pushed companies to export. To Westerners, it sometimes looked like industrial planning on the edge of socialism. To men like Sato, it felt like being enlisted in a war they nominally agreed with but never voted on. He was proud when he saw "Made in Japan" stamped on radios in foreign magazines. He was less proud when he realized his daughter saw him more often in photographs than in person. Forgetting as policy, remembering as private rebellion. By the late 1950s, Japanese society had developed an unofficial consensus. The war had been terrible. Japan had suffered, especially from the bombs and the occupation. Now, the primary duty was to rebuild, to become wealthy, to never again be helpless before foreign powers. The cost of this forward rush was silence about certain topics. School textbooks minimized Japanese atrocities abroad. Television dramas focused on romance, family, and the bright possibilities of modern life. Public talk of guilt or responsibility beyond a few set phrases was rare. Sato noticed that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were memorialized with increasing ceremony, while Nanjing, Manila, and Seoul remained, if not denied, then distant and vague. "It is easier to remember yourself as victim than as perpetrator," he wrote. "It is easier to say, 'we were bombed,' than 'we bombed others.'" His own small act of resistance was his notebook. He wrote about the corpses in China, the burned children in Tokyo, the old man next to him in the office who still woke screaming sometimes. He did not publish. He did not show colleagues. In a society training itself to forget in order to function, his private memory felt almost subversive. At the same time, he participated fully in the system. He bowed at company ceremonies. He praised the president's vision in meetings. He encouraged his son to join a good firm and avoid physical labor. He did not tell the boy that, in his darker moments, he saw little difference between a life sacrificed on a Pacific atoll and a life sacrificed to a corporation's balance sheet. 1958, the skyline and the ledger. Back in his office, looking at the cranes and concrete pouring into new foundations, Sato closed his notebook as footsteps approached. A section chief stuck his head in. "Moriyama from accounting collapsed yesterday," the man said casually. "Blood pressure. They say he's in hospital. You'll take on his clients until we reorganize." Sato nodded. "You'll take on his clients until we reorganize." One more man added to the invisible casualty list of the miracle. He slipped the notebook into his desk drawer. On the street below, a loudspeaker truck from a new political party drove past, blaring promises of continued growth, better lives, more consumer goods. A woman in a Western dress crossed the street carrying a television set in a cardboard box. A group of schoolchildren in caps and shorts stared up at a billboard showing a happy family around a washing machine, the father in a suit, the mother smiling, the children clean and healthy. They were looking at a future built by men who had survived a past too heavy to be carried openly. Historians would later quantify the period. Average annual GDP growth, roughly 9% from 1955 to 1973. Exports multiplied many times over. Living standards rose dramatically. By the late 1960s, most urban households owned a TV, refrigerator, and washing machine. They would call it the Japanese miracle. In scholarly articles, they would map curves, analyze trade policy, discuss cultural factors, compare Japan to West Germany. Those analyses would be accurate as far as they went. But for Sato and his generation, the miracle was not a neat upward curve. It was a ledger with two columns. On one side, full stomachs instead of hunger, concrete apartments instead of shacks, schools for their children, trains that ran on time, factories humming with orders. On the other, 12-hour days as the norm, hearts giving out at 45. A past filled with crimes no one wanted to speak about. A sense that their lives had been used twice, once by the emperor's army, once by the corporate machine. We once worshipped steel in the shape of guns, he had written. Now it is the skeleton of office towers. He might have added, in both cases, the steel was indifferent. It did not care if it held up cannons or conference rooms. It simply bore the weight we placed upon it. We are the ones who must decide what that weight will be. In 1958, that decision was still unfolding, on drafting tables, in boardrooms, at dinner tables, and in the quiet notebooks of former soldiers learning how to live in a country where peace demanded as much from them as war ever had.